Okay, let's see. Number 18. The Empty Mountain. A mound this big should have a tomb in the middle. Silbury Hill does not. In the same Neolithic landscape as Avebury, builders raised an immense green mound of chalk and earth, layer by layer, in the 3rd millennium BCE. A monument on this scale makes us expect a center, a king, a chamber, a sacred cache, some reason grand enough to justify the labor. Silbury gives us none of it. In 1776, miners sank a shaft from the summit looking for a central grave. In 1849, another search drove a tunnel in from the side. In 1968, archaeologists returned with BBC cameras and showed that the hill had been built in stages. They still could not say why. In 2000, the summit collapsed into a 14-meter-deep crater, damage left by those earlier digs. The dates hold. The tools are ordinary. The hard part is accepting what early societies could do. In 1776, on a Wiltshire hillside, Hugh Percy, Duke of Northumberland, paid Edward Drax and a team of miners to cut down from the summit toward the center. They were digging into a mound 30 meters high and more than 160 meters wide. A shape like that makes later ages look for a ruler. Silbury was not a grave raised over one spectacular death. Built around 2470 to 2350 BC, south of Avebury, it started smaller, 35 meters across and 5 meters high, beside a ditch 100 meters in diameter that could hold water. The evidence points to building, not burial. Turf, soil, chalk, and stone were added in stages until the mound reached 39 meters high, 168 meters across, and 500,000 tons. English Heritage estimates 4 million hours of labor. From the base, it stops looking natural almost at once. The mound is not quite circular. Straight construction lines ring the lower edge, as many as 9, as if the builders kept correcting the form while it rose. The dates here are firm. The tools are ordinary. What fails is the old assumption that late Neolithic communities in Britain needed kings, palaces, or metal to organize labor on this scale. Silbury shows they did not. The old expectation survived because the mound felt too large to be empty. In 1849, Dean John Merriweather drove a tunnel into the side, hunting the same answer promised by the summit shaft: a chamber, a burial, a center worthy of the effort. He found no burial. People kept looking anyway. In 1968, Professor Richard Atkinson reopened Silbury, with BBC television cameras watching. No hidden king appeared. What emerged was sequence. The hill had been raised, enlarged, reworked, and faced over time. That turns it into a very different kind of monument. It looks less like a container hiding a secret, and more like a project whose meaning lived in the making itself, in repeated gatherings, in the act of piling up a mountain where no mountain had been before. Long after its builders were gone, Silbury still pulled people in. Roman survey evidence shows a road and settlement around its foot. The mound continued to shape movement through the landscape. It still withholds the thing excavators expected from a monument this large: someone important, dead, and central. It remains the largest prehistoric artificial mound in Europe, and the center is still empty. By May 2000, the damage had become visible. A crater 14 meters deep opened on the summit, caused by instability linked to the old excavations. The hill was not revealing a secret. It was giving way under the damage done while people searched for one. English Heritage went back in during 2007 and 2008 for a different kind of intervention, using 1,465 tons of chalk and a pumped fill more than 99% chalk. The last major work at Silbury was repair, not excavation. The tunnelers expected a royal grave, a chamber, proof that a monument this immense obeyed the later logic of power, where scale serves a body and architecture points to an owner. Silbury Hill gave them engineering, sequence, geometry, and labor on a colossal scale. It never gave them the royal answer they were digging for. There was no central burial, no chamber, no body at the center. Number 17. The calendar of weight. The machine that used the sky as a blueprint began, in at least one measurable way, with 120 meters of empty air. In June 2026, archaeologist Phil Harding and a Wessex archaeology team announced 2 enormous post pits at Bulford, about 5 kilometers east of Stonehenge. 2 holes in the ground. They sat 120 meters apart. Their line caught the summer solstice sunrise in one direction and the winter solstice sunset in the other. The date mattered more than the timber, roughly 3000 BC, about 500 years before the great sarsen stones were raised on Salisbury Plain. That number changes the picture. Stonehenge is often imagined as a miracle dropped into the landscape complete. The sequence says otherwise. Around 3000 BC, Stonehenge was not yet the ring of giant uprights people carry in their heads. It was a circular ditch and bank. Cremated burials were placed in and around the Aubrey holes. A cemetery came first. The dead came first. The stone spectacle followed later, around 2500 BC, when the sarsen circle and trilithons were raised. Inside that long transition sits one missing journey. A single bluestone pulled out of West Wales and brought roughly 225 kilometers to this plain. 25 kilometers for the big local sarsens from West Woods in Wiltshire is hard labor. 225 kilometers is something larger. It means a route, planning, stopping places, hands to pull, animals for food, people willing to move for reasons that were not practical in any ordinary sense. Stonehenge matters to the larger question of what early societies were capable of, because the issue here is not whether Neolithic Britain could stack rocks. It is whether it could think at the scale of a map. Take the stones by distance. The Saracens came from around 25 kilometers north, difficult but local. The bluestones came from the Preseli Hills in West Wales, around 225 kilometers away, already extreme. Then there is the altar stone. In 2024, geochemical work pointed not to Wales, as long assumed, but to Scotland, around 750 kilometers away. That gives you not one supply zone, but at least three. Not one community showing off, but a connected island moving sacred material across hundreds of kilometers. Now take the monument by phases. About 3000 BC, ditch, bank, cremation cemetery. About 2500 BC, the main stone circle. Between those dates lies half a millennium of changing use. That matters because the old fantasy version of Stonehenge needs one dramatic act of construction, one impossible burst of genius. The archaeological version is stranger. People kept coming back. They reworked the site. They add to it. They reoriented it. They treated the place less like a single project and more like somewhere that had a schedule. The sky was part of that schedule. The axis of Stonehenge aligns with the solstice positions. Bulford changes the feel of that fact. It suggests the solar geometry was being tested in timber before it was fixed in stone. The blueprint may have lived first in wood, on the horizon, and in repeated gatherings long before anyone raised the famous uprights. The mystery shifts. Not who invented the alignment, but who maintained it long enough to turn an idea into a landscape. Stonehenge was never alone. At nearby Durrington Walls, evidence of feasting points to gatherings on a scale large enough to feed labor. Not labor as an abstraction, actual bodies, actual arrivals. On May 3, 2002, excavators uncovered the Amesbury Archer, about 3 miles from Stonehenge. He had been buried around 2300 BC, with 5 beaker pots, 18 arrowheads, 122 flint tools, 3 copper knives, and a pair of gold hair ornaments. The grave does not prove he built the monument. It does show movement, status, exchange, and a world larger than one village on one plain. The same pattern appears in the human remains. Scientific work has suggested some of the cremated dead at Stonehenge had links westward, toward Wales. The bluestone journey stops looking like a transport problem. Stone, people, and probably memory were moving along the same routes. This is where Stonehenge breaks the old model. It does not need fantasy technology. It does not need aliens. It forces early Britain to look coordinated, ceremonial, and geographically connected centuries before the comfortable version of prehistory allows. A cemetery became a solar machine, a timber experiment became stone, and a blue stone from Wales was never heading to an isolated monument. It was heading into a ceremonial landscape already spread across the plain. Posts had marked the solstice line there 500 years earlier. The dead were already being brought in. At midwinter and midsummer, people kept arriving. Number 16. The giant temples. What do you call it when an island starts building in stone before the empires, and later people look at the result and decide giants must have done it? On the Zagra Plateau of Gozo, around 3600 BC, a farming community began raising walls so large that later generations could not imagine ordinary humans moving them. That is where the name comes from. Ggantija, the place of the giantess, a folk story shaped around the stones. From a distance, the story almost fits. The megaliths are hard coralline limestone. They form outer walls that still feel oversized even now, after weather, collapse, and 5,000 years of damage. For a long time, the legend handled the problem in the simplest way possible. If the stones are too big, make the builders bigger. Up close, the site gets stranger. This is not a brute heap of rock. It was planned. The earlier structure, now called the South Temple, follows a 5-apse layout. Curved chambers open inward in a deliberate pattern. About 400 years later, another generation added the smaller North Temple beside it, with 4 apses and a terminal niche. Then they built a semicircular forecourt in front. Even the approach became part of the design. You do not simply arrive, the place directs you. What unsettles the timeline here is not the usual fantasy version, not aliens, not a lost machine age. The harder fact is simpler. These structures are real, so something has to give in our assumptions. The dates, the tools, the people, or the way we imagine what small early societies could organize. Gozo is a small island. Yet by roughly 3,600 to 3,200 BCE, its temple builders were producing some of the oldest surviving freestanding stone monuments on Earth. Modern visitors usually misread the site in one basic way. Today, Ggantija stands open to the sky, a dramatic ruin that seems readable at a glance. But Heritage Malta curator Daphne Sant Caruana stressed in 2020 that the temples were probably roofed. The ancient experience was not broad daylight over exposed stone. It was enclosed space, controlled movement, darker chambers, softer interior limestone shaped into doorways, altars, and decorated slabs. Fragments of plaster with red ochre show that these rooms were finished and colored, not raw and gray as they look now. The tourist sees a skeleton. The builders made an interior. So the engineering is only half the story. The other half is atmosphere. You pass through the entrance. The huge outer stones give way to shaped inner surfaces, painted plaster, chosen thresholds, and whatever took place at the altars beyond them. Animal bones and ash point to repeated ritual activity. They do not give us the script. No surviving text names the gods. No inscription explains the order of ceremony. The architecture is specific. The belief behind it is still mostly silent. Somewhere around here, this island earns its place on the list. Number 16, the island that built before the empires. Not because it is the largest monument in prehistory. It is not. It belongs there because of the combination. 2 temple structures, separate entrances, 1 common megalithic outer wall, a forecourt added later to stage gathering and approach. And only about 400 meters southwest, the Zagra Circle burial complex, where generations of dead were placed with grave goods. Ggantija was not standing alone on an empty plateau. It belonged to a ritual landscape, ceremony in one place, ancestors in another, people moving between them across a short stretch of ground. That answers the easy question of who could have built it. Farmers could. Neolithic islanders could. Communities with time, labor, memory, and reasons could. The harder question opens after that. Once giants are gone, the human explanation asks more of us. You need a society able to quarry different limestone types for different functions. A society that could maintain a building tradition across centuries, repeat a temple plan, and preserve whatever authority kept people returning generation after generation. UNESCO listed Ggantija in 1980, then expanded the designation in 1992 to include the wider Maltese temple tradition. That recognition matters, but it can smooth out the shock. World Heritage Site sounds neat and settled. This was neither. This was a prehistoric island culture, building on a monumental scale, building ceremonially, and building with architectural intent, long before the classic urban empires that usually dominate the story. The legend never prepared anyone for the real turn. The giantess did not build these temples. Real people did. The harder mystery remains. The temple culture of prehistoric Malta built several megalithic complexes. It left behind roofed ceremonial spaces, a ritual landscape, and this scale of labor. Then it disappeared as a distinct archaeological horizon. You stand in the forecourt. You move toward the doorway, from bright sun into shadow. The people who knew exactly what happened inside are already gone. Number 15. The village under the storm. In 1850, winter hit the Bay of Scale hard enough to tear the coast open. Wind and high tides stripped sand and turf from a low mound on mainland Orkney. In the raw face left behind, a stone wall appeared where no wall should have been. At first it looked small, just masonry in a storm-cut bank, half seen, half buried, while the sea kept working at it. A prehistoric home that still has furniture. William Watt, the local laird and an antiquarian, went to the spot and began clearing what the storm had exposed. What emerged was not a tomb, not a fort, not a lone hut. He uncovered 4 houses, a passage linking them, and objects from a settlement so completely hidden that centuries of local memory had let it vanish. Skara Brae did not shock people with a monument. It shocked them with a household. You step inside and the scale changes at once. Each house is about 40 square meters. A single main room, sunk into the ground, tight and deliberate. A central hearth. Stone beds against the walls. Storage. And directly opposite the doorway, a stone dresser built to be seen the moment someone entered. This is not rough convenience. It is layout, repetition, choice. The passages between the houses were covered, so people moved under shelter. The furniture was stone, because timber was scarce on Orkney. Even so, the effect is stranger than that practical explanation suggests. The rooms still read as rooms, beds at the sides, fire in the center, storage fitted into place, tools and ornaments found inside. The village is old enough to stand beside the first great stone traditions of Europe, yet intimate enough to feel recently vacated. The setting people picture now is wrong. Today, Skara Brae seems pinned against the shore, one good storm away from the Atlantic. But it was not built as a seaside village. It originally stood inland, beside a freshwater loch. The cliff edge drama belongs to a later story, shaped by coastal change over thousands of years. The same force that revealed the site also distorted the first impression. The village did not choose the sea came to the village. That mattered again in 1924, when another severe storm damaged the site badly enough to destroy House 3. State care followed. A seawall followed too. Rescue also brought excavation, and excavation brought a new mistake. From 1928 to 1930, Gordon Child dug more of the settlement and made Skara Brae famous. He could see the planning, the linked houses, the fittings, the coherence, but he placed it far too late. In 1931, he published it as Pictish. The site was sitting in front of him. Walls, hearths, beds, dressers still in place. Even so, one of the most influential archaeologists of his generation pulled Skara Brae toward a later, more familiar history. The earlier date demanded too much. A standardized village on a remote northern island. Carefully built houses, fitted stone interiors. No obvious defensive logic. No need for kings, giants, or lost super-civilizations. Just Neolithic people, living with an architectural discipline the old story had not saved a place for. Only in the 1970s did radiocarbon dating lock the settlement into the Neolithic, roughly 3,100 to 2,500 BCE. That puts Skara Brae before Stonehenge's main stone setting, and before the Egyptian pyramids. The site does not break history with impossible technology. It does it with ordinary life, fireplaces, storage spaces, passageways. A built environment repeated from house to house, as if a small community on the edge of the North Atlantic had already worked out planning, labor, and shared design long before agriculture was supposed to mature into anything this settled looking. Today, 28 structures have been discovered, and 10 are visible. Since 2010, Historic Environment Scotland has laser scanned the site and the surrounding bay every 2 years, because the threat has never changed. Storms exposed it in 1850. Storms damaged it in 1924. Storms are still measuring out what remains. And the storm that opened the mound did not reveal a single buried house. William Watt had cut into the edge of an entire Neolithic neighborhood, with stone beds, hearths, and dressers still waiting in the dark. Number 14. The city beneath the door. The escape plan carved under a continent. In the official account from Derinkuyu, it starts with a wall. In 1963, in the town of Derinkuyu in Cappadocia, an unnamed resident was repairing his house. He broke through masonry and found a passage where no passage should have been. Behind it was not a cellar or a storage niche. It was a corridor leading into a buried settlement cut down through the volcanic tuff of central Turkey. Rooms opened off the passage, then more rooms, stables, store spaces, kitchens, wells, ventilation shafts, churches. In the corridors stood circular stone doors that could be rolled shut from the inside. That detail shifts the whole scene. A round stone slab set into a passage is not decoration. It is a defensive choice. Someone expected pressure from the other side. The door was made to stop it. The site, now called Derinkuyu, descends to about 85 meters when the water well on the 7th floor is included. Official local descriptions say 8 cleaned levels are open or prepared for visitors, with 12 or even 13 floors estimated if the whole complex were cleared. An engineering study puts its sheltering capacity at up to 20,000 people. Not only people, animal spaces are part of the design, because a refuge that cannot keep livestock alive is not a refuge for long. What looks like a maze at first is something colder and more deliberate, a survival machine. UNESCO placed the rock sites of Cappadocia on the World Heritage List in 1985. It presents Derinkuyu and nearby underground settlements as part of a human landscape used as refuge in later periods. Turkish official material ties that long used to pressure that kept returning in different forms: Roman authority, early Christian insecurity, later Arab raids. The chronology of the first excavation phases is still uncertain. That uncertainty keeps pressing on the same fault line running through this story. When a site seems to break history, maybe the problem is not the stone. Maybe the problem is our picture of what organized people under threat could build. Walk the place in your mind, and the engineering appears one function at a time. Air first. You are tens of meters below the surface, in darkness, surrounded by stone. Yet the city breathes through vertical shafts, cut with enough precision to feed the lower levels. Water next. The district governorate describes 52 drinking water wells, around 60 to 70 meters deep. Some were connected to the underground system without exposing the inhabitants to anyone waiting above. Then, food. Storage rooms sit inside the complex, because hiding for a night is one thing, and hiding through a siege is another. Then animals, because draft power, milk, meat, and heat all matter underground. Then worship, because even in concealment, communities do not stop being communities. They carry belief with them. Derinkuyu feels wrong at first because it refuses to behave like a ruin. Most ruins announce themselves. Walls on a hill, towers on a plain, streets visible from the air. This one sat under ordinary houses. Its planning was vertical, sealed, inward-facing. A city designed not to be seen still had to solve the same problems every city has to solve: circulation, air, water, storage, waste, defense, social life. It solved them underground. There is even a modern afterlife to that shock. The Turkish Museum's brochure notes Erich von Daniken's 1982 visit, another attempt to drag the place out of human history and into fantasy. Fantasy is the less interesting answer. Real people, under repeated danger, are harder to dismiss than aliens. They force us to admit what coordinated labor can do when survival is the brief. The defensive logic is brutally specific. Those stone doors were not broad gates for ceremony. They were round blocks fitted to choke points, built to control movement through narrow passages. If attackers got in, they would not enter a grand hall. They would hit constriction after constriction. Numbers would collapse. Momentum would die. Bodies would be forced into single-file space, while the people below knew every turn. The architecture itself fought back. Go back to that broken wall in 1963. A homeowner removes part of his house and finds that his floor sits over a hidden world large enough to shelter thousands. Visitors today see only the cleaned fraction. Much remains inaccessible. The full map is still incomplete, but the essential fact is already there in stone. This was never a curiosity carved for a few fugitives. It was built for endurance. And somewhere in those passages, when danger came close enough and voices carried down the tunnel, someone put both hands against the rim of a round stone slab and rolled the door across until the corridor disappeared. Number 13. The city with drains. A street drain comes first, brick-lined, covered, sloped so water keeps moving instead of pooling in the lane. A small opening lets household wastewater enter. A soak jar or pit catches heavier waste before it clogs the main channel. Show that plan to a modern town engineer, and the logic is instantly familiar. In 1922, R.D. Banerjee of the Archaeological Survey of India began work on a mound near the Indus River in Sindh, about 28 kilometers from Larkana, and roughly 510 kilometers northeast of Karachi. A Buddhist stupa stood on top. It was visible, late, familiar. The bricks beneath it were older, far older. What opened under Banerjee's feet was not a shrine, not a tomb, not a heroic ruin built around one obvious centerpiece. It was a city laid out in baked brick. Start with the grid, streets meeting at right angles, planned blocks, then the water system. More than 700 wells across the site fed homes, bathing areas, and public structures. Egypt had pyramids. Mesopotamia had palace walls and royal inscriptions. Mohenjo-Daro had access to water, drainage, and brick dimensions repeated so consistently that repairs could follow an existing standard instead of being improvised. That shifts the picture. The city flourished in the 3rd millennium BCE. The surprise is not the date, it is the priority list. John Marshall's team expanded the excavations through the 1920s and 1930s, and the arithmetic kept getting stranger. The protected ruins cover about 240 hectares. Only around 1/3 has been excavated. Even that fraction revealed bathing platforms inside houses, drains running along streets, and walls built in kiln-fired brick across a floodplain, where maintenance would have been constant, not optional. This was not ornamental order. It was administrative order, repeated hundreds of times at domestic scale. Then the numbers narrow to one structure, the Great Bath, about 39 feet long, 23 feet wide, 8 feet deep. Steps descend at both ends. The brickwork was made watertight. A covered drain carried water away. It is the closest thing Mohenjo-Daro has to a monument, and even here the monument is controlled water. No giant king carved into stone, no royal burial chamber, no obvious throne room. The strongest statement the city leaves behind is simple. Clean water came in, dirty water went out, and somebody cared enough to standardize the process. A fortress tells you where power stands. A temple complex tells you what power wants you to worship. Mohenjo-Daro says something else. Its rulers, if that is what they were, left no pharaoh's body, no palace facade, no readable archive explaining who gave the orders. The script is still undeciphered, so the evidence has to be read the hard way, through repetition. One well is convenience. 700 is policy. One drain is a household fix. Drains built into an orthogonal street plan are governance. Mohenjo-Daro also drew stories that were easier to tell than the real one. A cluster of skeletons turned into a massacre legend. Later came claims of an ancient nuclear war, as if a Bronze Age city this organized had to be pushed outside human history to make sense. The material says otherwise. The harder truth is less theatrical and more disruptive. Ordinary services were the prestige project. The city looks most sophisticated in the very places older models treated as secondary. Another number sits beneath the site's fame. The last major excavation ran in 1964 and 1965 under G.F. Dales. After that, archaeologists largely stopped opening large new areas. The mystery was not solved. The problem was damage. Exposing more of the city risked destroying it. The same floodplain logic that helped create Mohenjo-Daro now wears it down. Salts rise through the bricks. Groundwater moves. Monsoon rain strikes exposed walls. Heat expands and cracks what excavation uncovers. Between 1974 and 1997, a UNESCO safeguarding campaign put about $8 million into flood protection, groundwater control, conservation, and a site laboratory. Preservation became a race against the landscape. So the forensics stop in an awkward place. We can measure the bath, we can count the wells, we can trace the drains. We can see a planned city on a scale large enough to demand coordination, labor, standards, and oversight. But the city that kept wastewater moving with practical intelligence still withholds the disclosure historians usually expect from urban power. No king's tomb, no palace everyone agrees on. No deciphered administrative archive, just order, repeated block after block, and only about 1/3 of Mohenjo-Daro has been excavated. Number 12. The city on the reef. A basalt column lies half in the grass, half against a collapsed wall at the reef edge off Pohnpei. It is dark, jointed, and so heavy it looks less like masonry than a fallen tree turned to stone. There is no quarry beside it, only tidal water, coral fill, and channels where the sea moves in and out. By the time European visitors began describing Nan Madol in detail, They found a city assembled in a place that seems wrong by design. On the southeast edge of Pohnpei, between the main island and Temwin Island in Micronesia, builders turned a reef-flat shoreline into a ceremonial and political center with more than 100 artificial islets. Seawalls made of stacked basalt columns enclosed tombs, residences, temples, and administrative spaces. Canals ran between them. The ruling Saudelur dynasty placed itself out here, physically apart from ordinary islanders, and at its height, that system claimed authority over roughly 25,000 people. Now it looks like a floating city. That image may be misleading. A 2024 study argues that around 1,000 years ago, much of this area may have been dry land, with sea level rise and subsidence helping create the waterlogged landscape modern visitors know. That shifts the site out of fantasy and back into engineering. The issue is not how some vanished civilization built on open ocean. The issue is how a real island polity built something this labor-hungry in a place the sea kept trying to reclaim. Recent coral and charcoal dates pushed the first construction activity into the 10th to 12th centuries CE. By about 1180 to 1200, the scale changes. High-precision dating and geochemical sourcing show major monument building underway, with columnar basalt brought from elsewhere on Pohnpei and set into elite architecture, especially at Nandowas, the Royal Mortuary Complex. One sourcing study analyzed 221 architectural stones, most traced back not to some lost source beside the walls, but to basalt from Pohnpei's main shield geology. The stone had to be moved. Nan Madol contains an estimated 300,000 cubic meters of stone building material. Not pebbles, not decorative slabs. Basalt logs stacked in crisscross courses, some several meters long, hauled into a tidal environment and balanced above coral foundations. A wall is one thing. A tomb is one thing. A ruler demanding distance and spectacle is easy enough to understand. At this scale, the site stops looking like a single monument. It starts looking like an economy. The old legend of mystery stones floating through the air skips the harder part. The city had to be fed, repaired, and kept politically worth the cost. Coral fill had to be gathered. Seawalls had to be maintained. Fresh water and food had to reach a ceremonial capital sitting out on the reef margin. The architecture separated elites from everyone else, but that separation worked only as long as labor kept crossing the water. Oral history puts a human face on that strain. It remembers the Saudelur as oppressive rulers. Around 1628, the warrior Iso arrived with followers, defeated them, and began the non-monarchy era. The story frames the end as political overthrow. Archaeology adds a colder pressure beneath it. Rising seas and storm damage may already have been turning Nan Madol into an endless repair project by its late phase. A capital built to display control may have become a machine for consuming it. Nan Madol matters because it does not demand impossible tools. It overturns the older picture of island societies as small-scale and politically thin. Here, ritual space, elite burial, labor coordination, and engineered separation fused into one landscape, not inland, on a reef edge. The reef, though, is only part of it. The basalt keeps pointing away from the walls, back across Pohnpei, back to the missing transport system. There is no excavated fleet, no preserved hauling apparatus, no simple mechanical answer waiting in the next canal. There is only sourced stone, stacked at a ceremonial capital where it did not originate. Nan Madol was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2016. In the same year, it was placed on the World Heritage in Danger list. Even now, the place is under pressure from vegetation, weathering, and water. The canals are quiet. Tomb walls still stand in places. At the reef edge, a basalt column still lies where no quarry is visible, and the route that brought it there disappears into open water. Number 11. The Earthquake Wall. In May 1536, above Cusco, Spanish soldiers looked up at Sacsayhuaman and saw the high ground in enemy hands. Manco Inca's uprising had taken the complex. From its terraces, Inca fighters sent heated stones and sling missiles down into the city. Thatched roofs caught fire. Streets turned into choke points. Cusco did not burn because of a myth. It burned because whoever held those walls controlled the valley. The modern myth begins lower on the slope. Tourists crouch beside the walls and try to slide a blade of grass or a sheet of paper between the blocks. The gap is so thin, it swallows the whole story. People stare at the polygonal joints, at stones cut into a dozen interlocking angles, and the explanation drifts toward lost technology, vanished giants, visitors from somewhere conveniently untestable. Sacsayhuaman resists that escape. The stones are real, the fit is real. What matters is not an impossible builder. What matters is the kind of society that could organize this much precision, on this much slope, and still make it work as a battlefield. When Juan Pizarro moved to retake the site, he was not charging at a ceremonial curiosity. He led about 50 cavalry and 120 infantry against the defended mountain position. 2 assaults failed under Inca fire. On the third, Juan Pizarro was mortally wounded. Hernando and Gonzalo Pizarro kept the attack going. They got men up the walls at night with ladders. The defenders fell back toward the towers. They ran short of stones and arrows. Many chose death over capture. The evidence is plain here. Sacsayhuaman was not only a beautiful wall that puzzled later visitors, it worked under siege. Calling it only a fortress misses almost as much as calling it alien. Officially, the wider Sacsayhuaman Archaeological Park covers 2,997.265 hectares, with a perimeter of 62,040.10 meters and 96 archaeological sites inside it. That includes bastions, terraces, sacred routes, water features, towers, outcrops, and linked places like Cuenco and Tambo Machai. Cusco's cultural authorities describe it not simply as a military work, but as the second most important place after Cusco itself, a house of the sun, tied into elite ritual geography and the symbolic plan of the imperial capital. The wall sits in both categories at once: temple and stronghold, ceremony and war. The older model wants neat boxes. Sacsayhuaman does not cooperate. The evidence against the fantasy version is dusty, repetitive, and brutally physical. Jean-Pierre Pratzen studied quarry marks, unfinished surfaces, and working traces. He showed how Inca-style fitting could be done with hammerstones, pry bars, repeated placing and removing, and surface pounding. No mystery beam, no lost machine. A stone is tested, lifted away, pecked down where it binds, and tested again, then again. The miracle gets smaller, only if the lazy part was the mystery. Once the impossible technology disappears, the harder problem comes into view: labor control, planning, transport, skilled supervision, and error correction on a massive scale. The site keeps growing as measurement gets better. In 2024, a project with 6 exploratory trenches and 39 specialists investigated early architecture, pottery, and radiocarbon sequences in areas including Muyuk Marca, Cruz Moco, and the Bastions. In 2026, drone LiDAR and geophysical survey across 69 hectares revealed hidden terraces, roads, structures, possible quarry zones, and even traces of erased excavations. The argument is shifting with the map. Was the monumental version mainly an imperial Inca project, begun under Pachacuti and continued under Topa, Inca Yupanqui, Huayna Capac, and Huáscar? Or did pre-Inca Quilqué planning shape more of the complex than older histories allowed? The dates are still being sorted. What has already collapsed is the smaller imagination that hands precision masonry to some outside force, because actual Andean states seem too human to have done it. Then the eye returns to that thin gap. Visitors come to Sacsayhuaman looking for the seam they cannot see. The answer was in the stones all along. Cusco's later colonial buildings cracked and fell in major earthquakes. These walls did not fail the same way. Their massive irregular blocks could shift, settle, and lock back into place. The fit was never just a spectacle for modern cameras. It was structural behavior. You can call it imperial architecture, ceremonial geography, or part of a park with measured hectares and catalogued sectors. In practice, it was a wall above a capital where men once fought hand to hand, and when the ground moved, the wall held. Number 10. The Andes Quarry Problem. A red porphyry block lies on the wrong side of the valley. It is not at the temple. It is not fitted into a wall. It is not even close. It sits above Ollantaytambo, across the valley at Cachacata, like a sentence cut off in the middle. In January 1537, Manco Inca Yupanqui was not dealing with an archaeological riddle. He had just failed to retake Cusco. He pulled his resistance army about 45 miles northwest into the Sacred Valley and made his stand at Ollantaytambo. This was a planned Inca estate city at 2,851 meters above sea level. Terraces climbed the mountain. Water ran everywhere by design. Hernando Pizarro came after him with the force that had worked before, roughly 70 cavalry, backed by around 4,000 indigenous allied infantry. Horses had shattered battle lines across the Andes. On open ground, that was usually enough. At Ollantaytambo, the ground was not open. The defenders waited above the plain, behind steep agricultural terraces and fortifications. Manco's engineers sent water into the low ground below. Good cavalry ground turned to mud. The river system became part of the defense. The terraces became firing platforms. Spanish horsemen tried to climb into a landscape already set against them. Pizarro failed to break the stronghold and withdrew to Cusco. The victory did not save the city. Spanish reinforcements came. The wider resistance collapsed. Later, in 1537, Manco abandoned Ollantaytambo for Vilcabamba. In leaving, he preserved something more useful than a legend. He left the worksite behind. Ollantaytambo changes the picture because the logistics are still out in the open. The stones are not impossible. The route is visible. If anything strains belief here, it is not the dates or the people. It is how much an early imperial society could organize, in plain sight, across this terrain. One landscape still holds the pieces together. Terraces, canals, fountains, inhabited Inca buildings, shrine spaces, roads, quarry zones, bridges that once linked the chain. Above the town stands the unfinished Sun Temple wall, 6 enormous red porphyry monoliths in a line, each one part of a project that stopped before it was done. Partway up the climb, the problem comes into focus. These stones had to cross the valley first. The quarries are not tucked beside the temple. They sit across from it. Large elite blocks were cut at Cachacata, on the opposite side of the valley. Then they were moved along a route that can still be traced through abandoned pieces, prepared paths, and construction scars. That makes Ollantaytambo unusual among famous stone sites. The monument is only half the evidence. The supply chain is the other half. Up on the slope, it stops feeling abstract. Below is the town, laid out with the same hydraulic discipline that helped stop cavalry in 1537. Across the valley are the terraces and temple platforms waiting for stone. Between them is the drop that makes the whole job hard to ignore. No wheels, no draft animals pulling heavy loads in the old world sense. No fantasy technology, just labor, planning, supervision, and the part grand monuments usually hide: transport. The dating fits the Inca imperial horizon, usually tied to Pachacuti's reign in the mid-15th century, with official ranges often given as 1438 to 1471, or extending the royal estate into roughly 1490. The builders are not mysterious. The state is not mysterious. The route still pushes people toward mystery, because the valley keeps forcing the same question. How did you move that there from here in one piece? The answer on this site is blunt. It is written in mistakes left on the ground. Along the route are the so-called tired stones, blocks that never arrived, not polished legends, failed deliveries, pieces abandoned on the slope, stranded between quarry and sanctuary. They do not make the place look more magical, they make it look human. A project this large did not slide from plan to perfection. It stalled, it jammed, it lost momentum. Somewhere between imperial ambition, civil war, conquest, and retreat, the chain broke. So when people stand below the 6 monoliths of the Sun Temple and look up, the most important evidence is not only the wall that was finished, it is the unfinished pieces still lying across the valley, marking the route more clearly than any chronicler could. The trail ends where another block never moved again, halfway to Ollantaytambo, on the wrong side of the valley. Number 9. The high-altitude blueprint. At 3,850 meters above sea level, the air near Lake Titicaca is thin enough to turn a staircase into a negotiation. On this plateau, stone has to be cut, hauled, aligned, drained, and elevated. It also has to keep its place in a climate where nights bite and the weather can turn fast. At Puma Punku, one carved block can look less like masonry than a machine part. The issue is not that it looks strange. The issue is why a ceremonial center at this altitude was built from a plan this exact. That plan survives in pieces at the top of the world. In 1893, the German archaeologist Max Uhl photographed the eastern side of Puma Punku. What he saw was already a ruin of a ruin. Platforms were fractured, andesite blocks lay scattered. Centuries of looting and treasure hunting had knocked the architecture out of position. Later viewers looked at those stones and rushed to impossible tools. The first solid fact is less dramatic and more difficult. The precision people fixate on survived inside a debris field. Roughly 150 andesite blocks from the standing architecture were no longer where their builders had placed them. Tiwanaku was not a lone platform dropped into empty land. Between about AD 400 and 900, it grew into a planned ceremonial city on the Bolivian Altiplano. Its monuments followed cardinal axes. Formal compounds structured the site. The Akapana pyramid rose in 7 superimposed platforms to more than 18 meters. Around the city spread an agricultural system that still feels forceful against the landscape. Almost 50,000 raised fields tied to its economic base. Puma Punku belongs inside that larger picture of early monument building. Sites like this force a harder question. What fails first? The dates, the tools, the people, or our sense of what coordinated societies could do before later empires made it seem familiar? At Puma Punku, the stonework makes that pressure sharper. The foundation used red sandstone slabs. Above and within that system came finely cut andesite blocks for gateways, windows, and the famous modular H-stones. Each measured about 97 by 99 by 55 centimeters and weighed around 600 kilograms. They look standardized because they were. They look machine-made because they were designed to interlock within a larger composition. But standardized is not supernatural. It is organizational. That becomes clear when the scale widens. One documented sandstone slab measured 8.12 by 3.86 by 1.2 meters and is estimated at 83 tons. The sandstone platform itself consisted of 17 slabs, defining an area about 6.75 by 38.72 meters. This was not an oddity on a hillside. It was a planned, ceremonial platform built from components. Some were massive, some were repeatable. Some were cut finely enough that every broken edge now looks like missing hardware from a lost device. The choice of stone was not only practical. Researchers have argued that Tiwanaku's builders increasingly shifted from nearby sandstone to more distant volcanic andesite, including sources around Mount Kakapia. That gave the material political, social, and cosmological weight. The city was not merely stacking blocks. It was pulling matter from a wider, sacred geography and forcing it into controlled form. Altitude, planning, and precision belonged to the same system. This was not one clever workshop. It was an engineering ecosystem tied to a regional power. By the 11th century, that power was weakening. In the first half of the 12th century, the empire collapsed. Even its end stays complicated. One line of research links a major drought beginning around AD 1000 to the fall of Tiwanaku. Another argues that the climate record does not line up neatly with the archaeological sequence. Drought may belong in the story, but it does not close the case. States do not fall as clean diagrams. They fray in stages, and monuments are left behind like arguments in stone. That is what makes the scattered blocks matter. For more than a century, Puma Punku looked like a pile of impossible fragments. Then archaeologist Aleksey Vranich returned to the old records. He worked with Ula's photographs, early field notes, and 3D printed models. He tested how the pieces may once have fit together. He modeled 140 andesite fragments and 17 sandstone slabs. The goal was not to prove fantasy technology. It was to recover a dismantled plan. The machine part block from the start of the puzzle belonged to something larger, not an engine. A ceremonial platform broken apart so completely that its precision survived better than its layout. Puma Punku does not break history by requiring aliens, lasers, or a vanished super-civilization. It breaks the lazy version of history. These fragments came from a real high-altitude center with fields, drainage, labor, quarry networks, symbolic stone, and architecture planned tightly enough to be reconstructed from wreckage. The mystery was never a single perfect block. It was an entire ceremonial design, dismantled so completely that later centuries inherited the parts and lost the platform. By Vranich's count, about 140 andesite pieces and all 17 major sandstone slabs were enough to begin testing the original arrangement. Number 8. The Desert Sky Lab. The calendar was buried where the rain disappeared. In 1998, A paper in Nature made a claim that sounded almost too neat for the southern Egyptian desert. J. McKim Malville and his colleagues argued that at Nabta Playa, about 100 kilometers west of Abu Simbel and 30 kilometers north of the Sudanese border, a ring of stones only 4 meters across marked cardinal directions and the June solstice sunrise. A calendar circle in the Sahara, but the paper also leaves a harder problem behind. Do these stones point to the sky or to water? Fred Wendorf and Romuald Schild had begun working there much earlier, in 1974 and 1975, with the combined prehistoric expedition. What they found did not look like the remains of a kingdom. Nabta Playa was a basin, roughly 10 kilometers by 7, dead dry now. But after the African monsoon shifted north around 11,000 years ago, it filled seasonally with rainwater. Lakes appeared, grass followed. Then people came with pottery, hearths, camps, and cattle. Not pharaohs, not cities, mobile herders moving in and out with the weather. That distinction matters. The older model places astronomy on this scale, with settled monument builders much later, not with pastoral groups crossing a wet desert. The excavation reports stay close to the ground. Dense hearths, animal bone, camps near the old playa edge, then stone. At Site E75-8, people began arranging sandstone blocks where seasonal life had already been happening for centuries. One line ran north to south, 9 large blocks, spaced across roughly 100 meters. Nearby sat the smaller circle. Farther out were cattle tumuli and a much larger buried complex of about 30 structures, spread across an area nearly 200 by 500 meters. Some shaped stones weighed up to 1.5 tons. One buried sculpture, described as cow-like, reached about 2.5 tons. An empty basin had become a planned place. The astronomical reading is the famous one, and the appeal is obvious. If Malville's interpretation is right, certain stones align with north and with the summer solstice sunrise. That would mean people in the late Neolithic, roughly 7,500 to 6,200 calibrated years before present, were doing more than visiting a seasonal lake. They were fixing time in stone. Long before pharaonic Egypt, long before the European circles that usually dominate this story. But the excavation record keeps pulling attention back to the soil. One tumulus held a complete young cow, placed inside a clay-lined chamber with a roof. Other large structures contain no bodies at all. Wendorf and Schild suggested some may have been proxy tombs, monuments for important people who died somewhere else during seasonal movement. The site is not just about watching the horizon. It is about gathering, ranking, remembering, and returning. Returning depended on one thing: rain. Stand there in the wet phase and the sky stops being scenery. It becomes logistics. The monsoon has to shift north. The basin has to fill. Grazing has to appear across a landscape that is now almost impossible to picture as habitable. The people who built these features lived inside a climate clock. A line to the solstice may not be abstract astronomy at all. It may be a seasonal warning written in stone. The strangest evidence comes from below ground. The excavators reported that some megalithic structures had been built above buried table rocks lying 2 to 3 meters under heavy playa clays. Somehow, the builders knew where those hidden stones were before they dug. The reports say the method is unknown. No inscription explains it. No surviving toolkit closes the gap. What remains is a pattern: selection, transport, placement, and ritual, in a place most people would dismiss as blank desert. Then the clock failed. Around 4,800 radiocarbon years before present, the region became hyper-arid again. The lakes failed. The camps stopped. The basin emptied for good. So when people call Nabta Playa a prehistoric observatory, that is true only if the second meaning comes with it. These stones may have tracked the heavens, but for the people who set them there, the heavens were how water arrived. By the end, the circle is not separate from the old lake. It stands where people waited for rain, buried cattle, raised stones, and tried to read a sky that decided whether the basin would live another season. At Nabta Playa, the calendar was not measuring time alone. It was measuring when the water should come. One day, it did not. Number 7. The blocks too big to ignore. At Baalbek in Lebanon, the count begins in the wall. 3 blocks, about 19 meters each. They sit high in the western rear of the podium of the Temple of Jupiter. inside a Roman sanctuary built 1,150 meters above sea level at the foot of the Anti-Lebanon Range. Above them stood columns almost 20 meters high. The platform beneath had to answer that scale. Stone answering stone, built to be read from far off. Then the numbers keep going. They run 800 meters out to the quarry and stop at a single problem. The biggest stone never arrived. UNESCO placed Baalbek on the World Heritage List in 1984. The core problem here is far older and very physical. The sanctuary grew over more than 2 centuries. Long construction can blur the hardest part of the work. One generation cuts, another hauls, a third raises. By the end, the monument looks seamless, while the labor behind it disappears. At Baalbek, the finished surfaces remain. The method does not. No ancient manual tells us how the heaviest blocks were dragged, lifted, aligned, and set. Look first at what is actually in place. The Trilithon blocks sit in the podium wall as though they were always meant to be there. But each one is roughly 19 meters long. Each weighs hundreds of tons. These were not ornaments. They were structural mass, locked into a platform that was already enormous before the temple rose above it. If this story keeps pressing on dates, tools, people, and the limits we assign to organized labor, Baalbek presses hardest on that last point. Roman ambition is no surprise. Roman ambition at this size, with so little operational evidence left behind, is harder to dismiss with a shrug. Then the site divides into 2 scenes. At the podium, the massive work was completed. In the quarry, the same effort seems to stop halfway through a sentence. There, cut from the limestone bedrock, lies the block later nicknamed the Stone of the Pregnant Woman. Its dimensions run about 20.76 meters long, 4 meters wide, and 4.32 meters high. The usual estimate puts it at around 1,000 tons. It is not standing in a wall. It is not stranded halfway along a route. It still rests in the quarry, tilted upward, as if workers carved around it, prepared for the next stage, and then never gave the final order. The stone that stayed behind is the one that kept the question alive. It belongs on any list like this for a simple reason. The evidence on the ground is stranger than the legends. Ancient builders really did work at this scale. The largest blocks at Baalbek are not the ones they moved. In the summer of 2014, a Lebanese-German team excavated beside and below that famous stone. Professor Janine Abdul-Masih led on the Lebanese side, working with the German Archaeological Institute project, led by Marguerite van Es. They were not digging for myths, they were looking for quarry marks, traces of transport, and datable debris. The routine details usually carry the real answer. What they uncovered made the known monolith look like a first attempt. Beneath it lay another worked stone, 19.60 meters long, 6 meters wide, and at least 5.5 meters high. Estimated weight, about 1,650 tons. The German Archaeological Institute described it as the largest known ancient stone block. It was never raised, never set, not even fully extracted. It remains in the quarry, still attached to the unfinished side of the operation. That changes the picture of Baalbek. The site preserves both outcomes at once, stones that reach the podium and stones that never left the bedrock. The strongest clue is also the least theatrical. The Institute reported that the Stone of the Pregnant Woman was probably abandoned because of poor stone quality and a natural crack at one corner. A block that large can survive the quarrying stage and still fail before transport begins. That shifts the story away from spectacle and back to engineering judgment. A 1,000-ton stone can be cut. It can be prepared for movement. But if the internal quality is wrong, the whole plan turns into a risk before the sled moves an inch. So the familiar image of Baalbek remains the temple. Columns, podium, Roman grandeur, a sanctuary built up over centuries. The working answer sits 800 meters away in the quarry. The biggest stone did not top the monument. It did not disappear into a lost method. It never went anywhere. It stayed where the crack was. Number 6. The hill that became a war. On October 20th, 2023, a paper in Archaeological Prospection turned a stone hill in West Java into a global argument almost overnight. Its claim was huge. Beneath the visible terraces of Gunung Padang, it said, lay buried construction phases so old they might date to 25,000 to 14,000 BCE. Headlines jumped straight to the superlative. The world's oldest pyramid, older than farming, older than cities. The hill itself had not changed, only the date had. Gunung Padang sits near Karyamukti in Cianjur, at 6 degrees 59 minutes south and 107 degrees 3 minutes east, on a volcanic hill about 885 meters above sea level. The visible complex covers roughly 900 square meters. The wider area spans about 3 hectares. 5 stepped terraces climb the slope. Andesite columns lie in rows, stacks, and broken pavements. From a distance, it has everything myths like: height, stone, order, age. But Gunung Padang was in the archaeological record long before the internet discovered it. In 1914, colonial researchers noted it as a strange terraced hill. After that, it slipped to the edge of official attention. It came back in 1979. 3 local residents, Endi, Soma, and Abidin, reported squared stones arranged in steps near the village. Indonesian researchers from Archaeological examined the site that year. They treated it as a megalithic sacred place, probably used around 2000 BC. That was already a serious claim, a ritual monument on a hilltop, 5 terraces, deliberately arranged stone, a real archaeological site, not a fantasy. But it stayed local history, and local history rarely goes viral. The explosion came later, when geologist Danny Hillman Nadawijaja and colleagues argued that the terraces were only the youngest surface of something much older buried below. At that point, the argument stopped being just about one hill. It became a test of what early societies could have built. If Gunung Padang really held human-made construction from the late Ice Age, then the oldest part of our historical model would take the hit. Not just the dates, the people we imagine behind them. The case sounded dramatic because it was laid out in layers. Unit 1, the visible upper construction, around 1000 to 2000 BCE. Unit 2, deeper down, around 5500 to 6000 BCE. Unit 3, deepest of all, 14,000 to 25,000 BCE. In that version, the buried hill was not natural terrain later reused by ritual builders. It was an ancient artificial core, modified again and again across millennia. That is, the mythic version of Gunung Padang. Not mythic because it is automatically false. Mythic because the scale of the story ran ahead of the evidence. The evidence had a problem built into the stone. Columnar andesite helps both sides. Volcanic rock naturally fractures into block-like columns and slabs that can look strikingly man-made. People can also gather those same columns and stack them into terraces, retaining lines, and ritual platforms with very little reshaping. So the same hill can produce 2 very different readings. One sees geology formed by nature, then reused by people. The other sees a buried monument whose artificial pattern still survives under the soil. Looks alone cannot settle that fight. A volcanic hill can look built, even when it is not. A real megalithic site can sit on top of exactly that kind of hill. So the fight moved to dating. Not the terraces everyone agrees exist. Not the obvious megalithic use around 2000 BC. The fight centered on the oldest dates, because those dates carried the entire revolutionary claim. If they held, Gunung Padang seemed to break history. If they failed, the hill stayed important, but familiar. A real ritual site with an inflated chronology. In March 2024, Wiley retracted the 2023 paper. The reason was brutally specific. The crucial radiocarbon dates came from soil samples not reliably associated with anthropogenic artifacts or features. In plain terms, old soil is not the same thing as old construction. Material inside a volcanic hill can tell you when that material formed or was deposited. By itself, it does not tell you when humans built with it. That is where Gunung Padang cuts cleanest. The terraces are real, the hill is real, the controversy is real. But the history-breaking claim collapsed on one forensic point. What, exactly, was dated? Not a wall with secure workmanship, not a cut surface, not a construction floor. Soil. And soil can date a context without dating the construction. Number 5. The second beginning. In 2019, prehistorian Nechmi Karul stood on a limestone rise in the Tek Tek Mountains, about 55 kilometers from downtown Sanliurfa, and began opening a site that had been sitting in plain sight since 1997. Surveyors had noticed worked stone on the hill years earlier. T-shaped pillar tops, quarry scars, enough to link it to the world of Gobekli Tepe, but not enough to know what that link meant. Maybe the first site was a one-off. Maybe one impossible sanctuary had appeared early by accident. Or maybe the break in the old prehistory story ran across an entire landscape. The excavation did not produce a copy of Gobekli Tepe. It produced something equally deliberate. On the western slope, Carul's team found a complex cut directly into bedrock. These were not walls set on the surface. The hill itself had been carved into architecture. The larger space, structure AD, measures 23 meters across. In one area, the bedrock had been cut as deep as 4.5 meters. 16 pillars divide the wall. 2 more stand at the center, facing each other. Benches run along the interior. Pits open in the floor. The whole space reads as planned movement inside a shaped arena. The route through the site makes the design even clearer. A stairway leads from structure AD into a smaller chamber, structure AB. It measures 7 by 6 meters. It is sunk 3.5 meters into the rock. At one end, another stair gives an exit. Along one wall, a carved human head looks into the room. Opposite it stand 10 phallus-shaped pillars left from the living bedrock itself. Carul suggested that the chamber may have guided people through a controlled passage, something initiation-like, movement with rules rather than a crowd drifting through open space. A descent was carved here. Bodies were framed in stone. The route aimed toward a pit. One more feature keeps the site from looking like a static monument. A serpentine channel runs toward structure AB, and a small opening between the larger and smaller structures may have allowed liquid to be poured into a pit. Water, blood, fermented drink. No one can say for certain which. What is hard to ignore is the setup itself. The architecture seems built to operate. It stages passage. It directs flow. It turns stone into procedure. That lands hard against the older model. In that version, settled farming comes first, then surpluses, then hierarchy, then specialized ritual buildings. Karahan Tepe belongs to the pre-pottery world, before ceramics, before the comfortable version of village life is supposed to take over the story. Yet the site already has carved bodies, monumental chambers, and route-controlled spaces fixed inside that era. Official project descriptions sharpen the problem. Karahan Tepe is part of the Taş Tepeler network in southeastern Turkey, a wider cluster of early Neolithic sites, not a lonely anomaly. The same project notes domestic-looking buildings nearby, with grinding stones and settlement features in the same landscape as the monumental chambers. The clean split between sacred precinct and ordinary habitation starts to dissolve. People were not making pilgrimages to an isolated wonder in the middle of nowhere. They were living near it. The same hill served as settlement ground and symbolic ground. The finds keep pressing that point. In 2023, Turkey's Ministry of Culture announced a seated human statue from Karahan Tepe, 2.3 meters tall, fixed to the ground inside a bench, with ribs, spine, and shoulders sharply emphasized. In 2025, the ministry announced what it described as the first known T-shaped pillar from the site, bearing a carved human face. The site already held pillars and human imagery. These finds make that visual language harder to minimize. It was not a single gesture. It was repeated. So the question is no longer who built one astonishing enclosure once, or whether one hill produced one miracle. The record now comes from multiple excavated spaces, shared symbols, repeated pillar forms, deliberate filling, and the same pre-pottery setting across a regional system. Gobekli Tepe looked unique because it entered the argument first. Karahan Tepe makes that uniqueness much harder to defend. The official description still sounds restrained. A pre-pottery Neolithic settlement with monumental architecture and debated ritual function. On the ground, the picture is more concrete. A community cut 23-meter chambers into bedrock. It routed bodies downstairs past carved heads and stone phalluses. It managed liquids through channels. Then it deliberately buried the entire performance. That is a pattern. Number 4. The drowned evidence. A limestone pillar stands under museum light, upright, cleaned, labeled, and far from the ground where it began. Arms run down its sides, hands meet across its belly. It looks less like a post than a human body pressed into a T-shape. What matters is not only what it is the absence around it. The pillar no longer stands on the terrace where it was raised more than 10,000 years ago, above the Middle Euphrates in southeastern Turkey. In 1979, survey teams mapping the future Ataturk Dam reservoir identified a site called Nevali Cori, about 64 kilometers northeast of Şanlıurfa. The valley was on borrowed time. Once the dam lake filled, the landscape would vanish. From 1983 to 1991, across 7 rescue seasons, the Şanlıurfa Museum excavated there, with Harold Hauptmann as scientific advisor. They worked ahead of water that had not arrived yet, but already controlled the schedule. What they uncovered was not a fantasy city or a lost empire. At first glance, it was a village, rectangular houses, domestic space. The familiar architecture of a pre-pottery Neolithic settlement, dated mainly to the 9th millennium BC, around 8,500 to 8,000 BC. People grinding, living, building. The kind of place that should fit the old sequence neatly. First villages, then farming surplus, then complex ritual buildings much later. Inside that village, though, stood a building the old sequence could not place. It had a polished lime terrazzo floor. That kind of surface takes labor, fuel, planning, and time. Benches were built into the structure. 2 central T-shaped limestone pillars stood inside, with 11 more arranged around the interior. Some carried human features, arms, hands, a body suggested in stone, without being fully carved. Fragments of sculpture made the imagery stranger, including hybrid forms often described as totem-like. This was more than habitation, yet it was not cut off from habitation. The point is simple and unsettling. Early villagers were doing symbolic architecture, while they were also doing village life. That proof now lies underwater. Nevali Cori never gained the fame of Göbekli Tepe. It never had the chance. By the early 1990s, the reservoir was rising, and the site disappeared beneath it, drowned around 1991 or 1992 as the Ataturk Dam Lake spread across the valley. For a time, the place looked like a tragic footnote, a major excavation, a handful of extraordinary finds, and a landscape erased before the argument around it had fully developed. One archaeologist carried that pattern forward. In 1994, Klaus Schmidt returned to another hill roughly 40 to 50 kilometers away, Göbekli Tepe. He had worked at Nevali Cori. He had seen the T-shaped pillars there in context, not as isolated stones, but as part of a Neolithic architectural language. So when he looked at stones on that hill that others had dismissed as grave markers, he recognized them. The silhouette matched. The logic matched. He was looking at the same world. Excavations began the following year. The site that would force a global rewrite did not appear from nowhere. It was identified correctly because Nevali Cori had already taught Schmidt what he was seeing. That is the scale of Nevali Cori. Not just an early site with unusual pillars, but drowned evidence linking village life to monumental symbolism, before the most famous site in this story was even understood. Without it, Göbekli Tepe might still have been sitting in plain sight, misnamed, misdated, and underestimated. So that museum pillar carries more than catalog information. It stands there because its landscape is gone. The benches, the terrazzo floor, the rectangular houses around the special building, the terrace that once held them together now lie under reservoir water, not erased by age, submerged by a modern decision to dam the Euphrates. Beneath that still surface rests one of the clearest early clues that ritual, engineering, and settled communal life arrived together long before the old model allowed. Number 3. The tower before the city. What kind of community cuts a staircase inside a stone tower before there is even a city in the usual sense? Not a palace stair, not a temple stair with inscriptions explaining itself. This was a steep internal climb, hidden inside a conical mass of undressed stone, rising more than 8 meters above the ground at ancient Jericho. The question starts disturbingly early. In 1952, Kathleen Kenyon returned to the mound northwest of modern Jericho. She cut deep trenches through layers earlier excavators had only partly reached. She was looking for the city tied to biblical memory. Below the Bronze Age, she hit something much older, a pre-pottery Neolithic settlement on the western edge of the mound. There was a wall, there was a rock-cut ditch, and there was a tower. By the 1956 season, Kenyon's team had cleared a 4-meter passageway at the base of the staircase. In the fill, they found 11 human skeletons. In the final seasons of 1957 and 1958, the tower was exposed down to bedrock on the north, east, and south sides. Its entrance was finally uncovered. Inside was the feature that makes the whole structure feel out of place in time. A built stair climbing upward through the tower itself. If this belongs to the 9th to 8th millennium BCE, with the wider mound reaching back toward about 10,500 BCE, why did a settlement this early need an internal stair at all? Jericho forces the larger problem into view. If a site like this is real, what gives way first? The dates, the tools, the people, or the old picture of what early societies could do? The stones do not leave much room to hide. This is not a scatter of huts caught by luck in a trench. It is planned labor in stone, organized at the scale of a settlement. The structure itself is plain enough. The tower stands about 8.25 meters high. It is conical. It was built of undressed stone. It belongs to a larger arrangement that included the wall and the ditch. That does not happen by accident. It does not come from one household deciding to improve the neighborhood. People had to quarry stone, carry it, and set course after course so the mass would hold. Then someone had to plan a staircase inside it. A staircase only makes sense if people expected to move through the structure repeatedly, up and down, again and again. For a long time, the easy answer was military. Tower means defense, wall means defense, ditch means defense. It is a neat reading, and it makes the monument feel familiar. But the defensive character of Jericho's pre-pottery Neolithic wall is still debated, even in UNESCO's own evaluation. So the tower does not settle neatly into the role of the first fortress. In the 2010s, Ran Barkai and Roy Liran proposed a different possibility. They argued that the tower may have worked as a landscape device. Their case links three elements: the tower, its internal stair, and Mount Karuntul to the west. At Jericho, the summer solstice sunset falls on an azimuth of about 290 degrees. In their reconstruction, the mountain's shadow would strike the tower first, then spread across the settlement. That turns the tower into more than a high structure. It becomes part of a recurring event fixed to the horizon. You can see why that idea caught on. Midsummer, the sun drops, the mountain darkens. The first point of contact is not a random roof or an empty patch of ground. It is the tower, with the stair inside it. A community in one of the world's earliest major settlement contexts climbs stone steps and watches the edge of the day arrive on schedule. No king, no bronze, no writing. But there is planning, alignment, coordinated labor, and a monument that may have been built to make the landscape itself perform. The evidence still refuses to sit still. The tower may have had a practical role. Flood control has been suggested. Defense has not disappeared. It has only become less certain. Symbolic marking, territorial display, communal ritual, seasonal observation, all of them remain possible. Jericho does not overturn history by proving fantasy. It wrecks an older model for a simpler reason. By roughly 8,300 BCE, people here were already organizing labor for something much larger than immediate survival. So the staircase can only be answered part way. A very early community cut and built it inside a massive stone tower. The structure was real, deliberate, and costly in human effort. What those steps were for is still unsettled. Defenders may have climbed them, watchers may have followed a solstice line. A settlement may have used them in a ritual it never explained. Kenyon's trench reaches the entrance. Light moves across the stones. The purpose stays open. The scale of organization does not. Number 2. The city without streets. The city refused to invent streets. In 1961, James Mellart returned to a pair of low mounds on the Konya Plain in central Anatolia and, in 39 days, opened 40 mud brick houses. What emerged was dense, old, and immediately unsettling. The East Mound, now dated by UNESCO to roughly 7,400 to 6,200 BC, rose about 20 meters above the plain. House pressed against house, wall against wall. Between them, no roads, no lanes, no obvious courtyards, no palace, no temple district, no ruler's quarter. Sometimes the thing that fails is not the date or the tools. It is the picture in our heads of what a city is supposed to need. The first impression feels administrative, almost clinical. Packed architecture with no formal streets, entry from above, interior platforms, burials beneath floors, replastered walls, rebuilt houses layered through as many as 18 occupation levels on the East Mound. The plan looks tidy only until you imagine living there. You are carrying grain, water, ash, a child. There is no front door at ground level. You climb. Under your feet is not one roof, but hundreds of them, touching or nearly touching, a continuous surface of mud brick and timber. Smoke rises from openings cut above hearths. Ladders drop through those openings into dark rooms below. People move overhead. Traffic moves overhead. The space a later city would give to streets, Catalhoyuk gave to roofs. That detail reshapes the whole settlement. Streets separate houses from one another. These houses did the opposite. They fused. One building ended where the next began, but daily life kept flowing across the top. The settlement could be dense without displaying the usual signs of urban authority. No broad avenue told you where power lived. No central monument pulled movement toward itself. The house itself seems to have held the place together. These were not disposable shelters. Floors and walls were replastered again and again. The dead were placed beneath platforms inside the homes. Memory stayed underfoot. Some buildings seem to have carried long histories across generations, with rebuilding that preserved location more than individual walls. Archaeologists still debate whether Catalhoyuk was truly a proto-city of thousands or something smaller. Older estimates put the population at 3,500 to 8,000. A 2024 reassessment argued that, in an average year around 6,700 to 6,500 Cal BC, the East Mound may have held only 600 to 800 people. The lower number does not make the arrangement ordinary. It makes it stranger. A village can spread out. This one chose compression. In 1993, Ian Hodder reopened excavation after nearly 3 decades of silence, and the site began to look less like a town plan and more like a domestic archive. Wall paintings, installations, figurines, burials, layers of plaster covering layers of use. In the final week of the 2004 season, excavators working in Building 42 uncovered an adult woman buried beneath a platform. In her arms, she held a plastered human skull, painted red against her chest. The room changes when that image enters it. With the dead under the floors and a painted skull in someone's arms, the house stops looking like a simple unit of housing. It becomes shrine, tomb, inheritance line, and social address at the same time. Later DNA work complicated the old fantasy that this was simply a goddess city or a neat prehistoric matriarchy. It does not prove that, but it does suggest that genetic links within buildings were more often maternal than paternal, and that female children received more grave goods than male children. Whatever held Catalhoyuk together was organized through kinship, memory, and domestic ritual in ways that do not resemble the textbook sequence of chief, palace, temple, street. Streets do more than move people. They expose them. They sort neighbors from strangers. They create fronts, backs, borders, bottlenecks, public space. Catalhoyuk pushed all of that upward. The public surface was the roofscape. The private threshold was a ladder. The dead stayed inside the house. Authority, if it existed here, did not announce itself with stone facades or processional routes. It hid in repetition. Rebuild the room, replaster the wall, bury the body, climb the roof, descend through smoke. Here is the contradiction at the center of the mound. Officially, Catalhoyuk can be described as an early dense settlement with uncertain population, complex ritual life, and unusually compact architecture. In practice, people crossed the town by walking over one another's ceilings. A city changed shape before a single street was ever built. Number 1. The temple before farming. In 1994, Klaus Schmidt sat with an old survey note from 1963 and caught an error that had survived for 3 decades. A team from the University of Chicago and Istanbul University had walked a limestone hill about 15 kilometers northwest of Sanliurfa. They saw broken slabs pushing out of the ground and marked the mound as a likely medieval cemetery. Schmidt read the same line and saw something else. He drove to the hill in southeastern Turkey, climbed to roughly 770 meters above sea level on the Jermis Plateau, and understood that these were not gravestones. They were the exposed tops of something far older, far stranger. Excavation began in 1995. The surprise came almost at once. Just below the surface were rings and ovals of stone. Each was built around massive T-shaped limestone pillars. Some rose to 5.5 meters. Some carried carved foxes, vultures, snakes, and scorpions. Some showed belts, arms, and hands, as if the pillars were not simple supports, but stylized bodies standing in the round. The hill was not empty. It had been deliberately packed shut. That detail changes the site immediately. Why bury a place like this? Why spend the labor to fill monumental enclosures with stone, debris, and earth instead of simply leaving? At Gobekli Tepe, the burial is not a side note. It is one of the reasons the site survived long enough to confront history with its own mistake. The dates are the next shock. The main pre-pottery Neolithic occupation falls roughly between 9,500 or 9,250 and 8,000 or 7,750 Cal BC. This is not a Bronze Age sanctuary. It is not a late farming kingdom. It is not a civilization with metal tools and draft animals. This is the threshold of farming, before pottery, in the 10th millennium BC, and people here were quarrying limestone, moving monoliths, shaping planned enclosures, and covering them with a visual system structured enough that specialists still argue over how to read it. This place forced the sequence of civilization out of order. For a long time, Schmidt described Göbekli Tepe as a mountain sanctuary built by hunter-gatherers. The idea made sense. A mound of about 9 hectares filled with monumental architecture should not be here this early if the old model is right. That model put farming first, surplus first, permanent settlement first, then larger ritual buildings, organized labor, and carved stone. Göbekli Tepe appeared with the order scrambled. The pillars were already standing. Then the story became harder to reduce to a single line. Later work found evidence of domestic activity and settlement life as well. The site can no longer be described safely as just the world's first temple. That label was too neat. What stands on this hill now looks more like a settlement with an unusually powerful ritual core. For the old chronology, that is not a smaller problem. It is a larger one. If these people were not only gathering for occasional ceremonies, but living, building, carving, filling, and rebuilding here, then more than one date is under pressure. Our picture of what early societies could do before agriculture was supposed to make this scale possible starts to fail. The carvings matter for the same reason. They are not random decoration. Foxes recur, vultures recur, snakes recur. Abstract signs appear in ordered architectural settings. The pillars work as image carriers, not casual ornament. Someone chose these beings. Someone repeated them. Someone knew which combinations belonged in which spaces. Symbolic architecture like this does not happen by accident. It depends on shared meaning strong enough to coordinate hands, quarry stone, and return to the same forms again and again. So the central problem on this hill becomes more precise. Not whether this place existed. It did. Not whether the builders were capable. They were. The difficult question is what kind of society could do this so early? A loose gathering of foragers meeting seasonally for ritual feasts. A settlement already learning permanence. Or something between those categories, built before our categories were ready for it. Then the burial returns to the center of the story. The enclosures were deliberately backfilled. They did not simply collapse into ruin. They were not erased by chance. They were packed, sealed, protected by the same people who ended their use. Because of that, the pillars remained standing under the mound. The carvings stayed legible. The chronology stayed fixed in place long enough for radiocarbon dates, architecture, and context to speak together. Without that burial, the hill might have weathered down into broken stone and rumor. Just one more bad survey note from 1963. Instead, it sat under the earth and waited. In 2018, UNESCO inscribed Göbekli Tepe as a World Heritage Site. But the deeper inscription came much earlier. Pre-pottery communities on a hill above Sanliurfa raised stone bodies before pottery, before metal, and at the edge of farming. Then they hid them so completely in earth that the site outlived the model that said such builders should not exist. Night falls over the limestone ridge. One by one, the pillars disappear into shadow beneath their carved foxes and folded hands. The people who buried them did not preserve a mystery. They preserved evidence. Ritual, engineering, labor, and symbolic architecture were already here before agriculture was supposed to make them possible.